Hi, everybody. It's Angela here with Ed Brenegar. Ed, can you tell folks a little bit about who you are to start?
Certainly. I'm a leadership guide. I'm 70 years old, and I have been doing all kinds of things throughout my life, searching for ways to make a difference that matters. Um, I haven't figured all that out. I'm still learning. Um, I began my life. This is the joke. I began my life in a hospital to be close to my mother. Um, that's a joke. Born in a hospital, so
I
to be close.
began my life in a hospital to be close to my mother.
Um, I grew up in a time unlike the time we're living in almost every way. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It was a very segregated community that I grew up in. Went to all white schools all the way through high school. I had interactions with Black people. I had coaches that were and teachers who were African American, but it was an all white school. I had total freedom as a child to do what I wanted to do. I could walk out the door at 7 in the morning, not come home at 7 at night, and no questions would be asked. It was not a dangerous time. It was a time of real freedom for a child, and and we experimented. I'd climb trees. I would run across the roof of our house, and I did all kinds of things that I know that today parents would, but that wasn't the way I grew up. And I had a lot of freedom. In fact, when I was about 12 years old, my grandmother, my mother's mother, took me aside, and I'm one of 15 grandchildren. And I've checked with them, and I know that what I'm about to say was only said to me. So that means it carries weight. My grandmother said, "You may do anything you want, but do not bring shame to the family name." Boom. And when I tell that to people, I mean, maybe you hear this in this way. They say that what an awful thing to say. What kind of, freedom to go do anything I want, just as long as I do it in a respectful way that does not cause embarrassment to my grandparents, my parents, my sisters, or my cousins, to anyone of the generations that have gone before me, that our traditional family matters at some level, and not being totally independent of them means something. So I have really lived a life where I've just done what I've wanted to do. So I go off to college, went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I'm sitting in history class, uh, you know, kind of U.S. History 1, let's call it that, and my first semester. And I'm looking at the syllabus, and I'm looking at the list of the lectures, and I'm looking at we've got to read this. I don't know if I can do this. This is all so narrow, and I was taking a history course, a religion course, a literature course. I had freshman English and some other class, and that's what I was saying. And I was just overwhelmed by all of this, all of this specificity of knowledge that I had to master. And I can honestly say, throughout my 4 years of undergraduate work, I never read a complete book the entire time I was there. I just did not have that capacity to do that. It wasn't that I couldn't read fast. It was that I thought about everything. I thought about every sentence, and I still do that way. I can spend a day, or I can spend a week on a whole one paragraph thinking about what's going on in this paragraph. I mean, this is a very polymathic sort of thing. So I ended up as a American Studies uh, major, and that allowed me to take a range of courses. And we had 3 seminar courses and it was a small program. So that I think there was maybe 20 total students in the program. And I loved it. I really loved it because I could do things and I could ask questions. And it was a new thing. It was a new program at the university. So we were kind of setting the tone for what it was going to be in the future. And I'll give you an example of what this 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 program was like. So one of the seminar classes was, and this is such a contemporary thing, identity and consciousness in the modern world. What is that? I mean, who was talking about identity and consciousness in 1974? I mean, that was not talked about. But you know who we read? Marshall McLuhan, who was the first to kind of introduce this idea that media, the medium is the message. Media was this thing which had this indelible effect upon who we are as individuals. And so, so I began to think about identity as something separate from who I am as a person. I'm going to define myself. Here's my definition. And over, okay, that one, let's say I was 20, 21, 22 at that point in time. Well, almost 50 years later, we live in a time where we don't really know who we are, but we certainly can tell people what our identity is. Identity becomes a label. And because it's a label, it becomes something. And I felt this. I mean, I really felt this. Back then, I felt this, that a label becomes something that marginalizes you, that encompasses you and lets you say, you can only be this. So if you're going to be an accountant, that's all you can be. Or if you're going to be a minister like I became, you can only be a minister, or you can only be a lawyer, you can only be a teacher, whatever it may be. So the label you took on, the degree, the credential you have, said you can only do this. And when I graduated, I wasn't thinking that in those terms. I couldn't imagine a job that actually fit with me. And so I ended up going to ministry because that's, as a career, you can do a lot of different things in that. And I've done a lot of different things. So I became Presbyterian minister. And this is a longer story that I really need to tell, but basically I came to the realization that I'm not a very good parish minister because I want to create change. It's another polymathic sort of thing. I want to create change. So I ended up in a small college teaching and doing leadership work and being a chaplain. And that was great. It was a good transition point to when in the mid-90s I became a consultant, a leadership consultant. And my interest was in supporting local businesses and organizations, people, and strengthening them so that their families and their community could be strong. And that's still my purpose. That's, but that purpose has developed a global perspective with that. So I've been a lot of different things. So now I'm a writer and a podcaster, and I'm not doing any consulting anymore. Though if someone wants to hire me, I'll be glad to do it because all those skills, all that knowledge is still there. So I'm not labeling myself and saying this is what I am and this is the way you should see me and this is the only way you can come to me and access me. I'll give you one more illustration of how this functions. If you know about marketing, you know that marketers love to focus on a single segment of a market. So when we were putting my book together, this book, Circle of Impact, Taking Personal Initiative to Ignite Change, the team that was working with me on this said, so who did you write this book for? And what they were looking for, is this for the CEO of a business? Is it for the CIO, the CCO, the HR department? Who's it for? And I said, it's for everyone who sees themselves in transition. And they would say this, and in talking to other marketers, they would say, Well, we don't know how to market to those kinds of people because that's too broad. That doesn't work. I said, sure, it works. You just haven't tried it. And it's because we have labeled a lot, put people into these boxes, and we have labeled them, which has marginalized them and meant that they no longer have access to the kinds of help that they need, but also access to the opportunities to do service or to grow or whatever. So the kind of the story of my life is I've constantly been changing, constantly moving. I got married. I had 3 kids. Did a lot of different things as a father and as a husband. And then my role as a husband ended, and my role as a father continues, but in a totally different way because my children are grown. And so my life has continued to change. And even at the age of 70, I'm in the midst of one of the biggest changes that I've done in the last decade and a half, which is I moved back to my hometown. I bought a 5-bedroom house downtown, and I'm planning to create. My podcast is the Eddie Network. I'm planning to create the Eddie Salon or the Eddie Venue or something in my home where I invite people to come in and have unscripted conversations with me.
Oh, how fun. By the way, you touched on something I want to circle back to. You said something that felt really deep. And
Sure.
you basically said that we can have an identity, like we can have labels without even knowing who we really are.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
completely agree. And obviously who we are may morph and change over time, but the label identities like our race, our sex, our gender, our place of birth, like time of birth, those are all things we none of us got to pick. And so one of the things that's really also struck me, and I studied identity theory for my doctoral dissertation, and I hope added to the scholarly conversation in a new way, by the way, because part of what I realize is that some people get their identity from not fitting in anywhere, which is the case for many polymaths. And that was something that none of identity theory had ever acknowledged. But
Mhm.
anyway, the point I'd or and the conversation I'd like to have with you for just a second is just back on the idea of like how our identity is not equivalent to our labels, that we can pretend to have an identity based on labels, but like the real person is beyond any categories that the world gives us, right?
Right. 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 I mean, my identity is just basically as a person.
As a person, like the heart. And the heart isn't your meat suit
I, I don't,
or your bank
I
account.
don't, it's not your bank account. It's, let me come at it from a different direction. Because I think we do get caught up in these identity labels. And I feel pain for people who find they must um, become very adamant about their identity being some kind of categorization or label. Because I look at them and I say, you are so much more than that. You're I mean, you're a woman, but you're much more than a woman. You're a mother. You're much more than a mother. You have an academic, you've had an academic career, you've had a career in government, but you're much more than that. And I think that the way that our society has functioned over the last 200 or 300 years is to limit what people can do so that they fit into the social and institutional structures that exist. And those are going away. They're failing. They're very fragile and they're failing. And we can tell they're fragile because those who have built their sense of identity around them are finding that they are very uncertain about who they are. And so the real story is we're not who we say we are. We are who we are in relationship to other people. Who am I with you? Who am I with my children? Who am I with my neighbors? That's who I really am. And that doesn't really get well defined in some kind of category. It has much more to do with who I am as a being, as a person.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I approach this.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us could agree that like who we are is on the inside, you know? It's in our hearts and our choices, it's in our loving relationships. Like that's says a lot more about who we actually are.
Right.
And yet, like we still there's still like a lot of people who cling really tightly to like categories of identity that I mean, none of us picked. So, yeah, I look forward to a world um where we can kind of move beyond those boxes and category like check boxes, you know, and like acknowledge that a human being is more than what they look like from the outside.
Well, I think part of the dilemma that we face is that it is both politically and economically expedient to exploit these labels so that people will um, validate or rationalize the world that as it appears through the exploitation of people's identity.
And that sort of leads me into another question I want to ask you, which you're probably not expecting. But from what I know about you, you strike me as a really good, decent, honest, good-hearted guy. Like a guy who has morals and ethics. That's
Mm-hmm.
part of who you are.
I try.
And I'm curious from your vantage point, being like a good, moral, ethical guy, not a sociopath, not a psychopath, not a narcissist.
Right.
You don't have borderline personality disorder. Like you're able to be considerate of other human beings and you care and you want to be helpful and all that. What sense do you make about like where humanity is at right now? Our institutions, our values as a collective, the tech in play and all of this, like where is humanity at right about now? And where do morals and ethics play in where we're at?
It's a great question. It's a big one.
It's a big one, sorry. Answer it however you wish.
Hey, don't apologize because that's where I live. I live with the big questions. Let me say it in the simplest way possible. I think we're at the end of an era, actually, at the end of a couple of eras. And I think one of those eras is the era where um, the world was defined by the individual. And so I, I think, therefore I am, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore that's what reality is. I mean, how many times have I heard people say, well, reality is what we perceive it to be? No, that's your perception of reality, but your perception of reality is only a portion of what reality actually is. So I think that we're at the end of this highly reductionistic, materialistic era where everybody was reduced to what they did and who they represented as in terms of their identity and what their contribution to the industrial world was, and and therefore and it's a really interesting thing. Let me step back one step. So when this age began, let's just call this the age of enlightenment, age of industry. These ages that have spanned the last 3 or 4 centuries. When it began, it was following upon the era of the Renaissance and the Dark Ages, and it was at a time when there was a discovery of people as human beings, as individuals. Before they were always a part of some social group. You're part of your tribe, part of that community. And there weren't the tools, there weren't the mechanisms, there weren't the ideas which allow people to step forward to say, well, this is who I am. And so there was this discovery of the individual and the value of the individual. This is what, 700 years ago, let's say. And that was an important step forward. But at some point, a couple of 100 years into that, we began to separate that from what some would call an enchantment view or a mystical view or a spiritual or religious understanding of the world, which was really an understanding that the world was more than who I am and more than what I can grasp in my daily life. So that sense of transcendence and a transcendent reality um, began to be pushed out as separate from the reality that we were creating, which is a very imminent reality of I am what I am. This is what I do, and this is the way I want to be. And as a result, out of that came the Industrial Revolution, and out of that came this huge change socially and economically, where people became what they did. People became what their job was, and as a result, that worked. It worked as a transition point from where we were, be a change because all the symbolic references, the traditional references of the previous 2 or 3 thousand years had to be thrown over because I no longer was a member of a family. Let's just say the family was kind of the archetype of the traditional society of the pre-industrial age. But now we're in the industrial age, and so now I am a worker, and I work at the plant, and I do that kind of work. Um, and but then that got thrown over because you could still have family, you could still have church, you could still have these social institutions that that were referencing to an earlier era, and so the work was so something. So then there was another change that happened, and that other change was we all became consumers, and so we became not defined by what we did, but we became defined by what we could purchase or what ideas that we would take on. And so we've lived in this age of, I would call it consumerist age, where we are, the fact that I have an Apple notebook computer here says something about me. What does it say to you or someone else? It doesn't really matter. It says something about me. So we get defined by what we buy. And when the digital age occurred, this is really a long explanation. I
No, it's
apologize.
great.
But when the digital age occurred, that consumer orientation was transferred from physical products like computers and cars and clothing, and it got transferred to ideas, and in particular social ideas and political ideas. And so today you're not defined by what kind of car you drive. You're defined by what kind of engine drives your car. You're defined by whether you believe in the electric car rather than the internal combustion engine. That's an ideological choice of you're consuming an ideological choice at that point. And maybe you like Donald Trump, or maybe you hate Donald Trump, or maybe you like Joe Biden, or you hate Joe Biden. But those are now consumer choices, which define how we fit into society. So this is why I think we're at this very complex juncture where all of this is about to collapse or is already collapsing. And I saw that the COVID pandemic was the kind of the last straw in this, because people then began to realize that they no longer had a choice as to how they were to function in society. They were told you have to do this, and a lot of people that I know refused, and they viewed their resistance as liberation, and liberation from what before was all these rules that we must treat as consumer, in a kind of a consumer way. Okay, we have to be, I have to be a Democrat, or I have to be a Republican, or I have to be, I'm not going to be something else. And so that kind of at an ideological level, or at a choice level, or at an interest level, became how we began to define ourselves. And the problem with that is that those things are just words, they're concepts, and they may or may not have any reference to reality. And it would be safe to say that if you take all your if you make your choices based on what you receive from from social media, then you really don't know why you're making these choices. Because what I see is that what is emerging is we're going to make more of our choices in the future because we're having direct experience with other people. And from that direct experience, we become much more likely to understand who we are and what we want out of our lives.
Yeah, that was what I wanted to ask you is like, so you've sort of identified, and I think a lot of people would agree that the way we've done things historically and the way our systems have been designed isn't working for us anymore. Like the
Right.
world has changed, and so our systems and our institutions and our ways of thinking need to also be modernized. And so it sort of begs the question, like, okay, if we can all agree that like the old world is failing and we're in a transition period, well, what do you think the future is going to look like, or what should it look like? And maybe those are two different answers. I don't know.
Well, I don't know what it should look like. Anyone who tells us that they know what the future is going to be is marketing their expertise and not really. They don't really know. I don't think anyone really knows what the future is. You know, they're projecting their own desire for a particular outcome, which is important to understand. Oh, that's what you want to see happen. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. I think we're in a very fragile time. So this is what I see as the possibility of change. We have lived in such an institutionalized world where all of our sense of identity was based on the institutions that we're a part of, the place of work, the place of faith, the church that I go to, or the synagogue, or the mosque, the club that I've joined, the political party that I'm a member of. All these are institutional forms that define us. And I think those institutional forms are failing because they are no longer based upon values which unite people together, but rather values that are used in opposition to other people. So what I see happening is that we're going to enter into a time where relationships become much more important and community becomes much more important. And those will happen wherever we are living locally. So there'll be a local emphasis upon things growing. And my relationship with you or my relationship with my neighbors across the street here are going to be more important than all the people on Facebook and all the people on LinkedIn that I know. Because like there was a fellow that came over the other day and he says, I see you need your grass mowed. And I said, yeah, I haven't bought a lawnmower yet. He said, would you like me to do it? I said, yeah, I would like that. I'll pay you some money. And so he went down and got his mower and came over and mowed my grass. And now he's going to mow my grass twice a month. So we have a relationship. It's not transactional because I said, whatever I can do for you, just ask. I'm glad to do it. So I think these kinds of relationships are going to emerge as the future, and they will become they will have more to do with how we make our choices, our consumer choices, because they're going to give us information that we're not going to get from social media. They're going to, there are people that I know that, here's an example. I moved from Wyoming to North Carolina in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. And in September of 2021, I woke up and I had lost hearing in this ear. And I had not been sick in decades. I'm never sick. I'm so healthy. And but here I am, having lost my hearing in this ear, and I didn't know what to do. So I went and asked people, my neighbors, other people that I had met in the 10 months that I had been there. And one person said, well, I think you need to go see this doctor up in this town nearby. So set up an appointment, went to see him. And I I was at a point of kind of despondency over the loss of hearing because if I lost the hearing in this ear, you and I wouldn't be able to have this conversation. And that to me would be a crushing blow to my life.
Mhm.
And I told him, I said, I need, I need to, I need my hearing, and I believe that you're going to be the person through whom I'm going to be able to keep my hearing. He says, I guarantee you, you're going to have hearing the rest of your life. And all that sense of despondency just went out the door. Now, why did from all these people that I talked to, why was he the one that I ended up going to? Well, it turns out he's an ENT, and it turns out he's been going to Africa for 25 years, to Kenya, to do ENT work with the Maasai. And prior to the pandemic, I was going to Africa, to Kenya, to do leadership training with people from a number of countries there. And so all of a sudden we had this bond that transcended my illness and his profession. Now we had something to share as two old men who have a love of Africa. See, that's the sort of thing I believe will happen if we allow ourselves to be in relationship with our neighbors.
Yeah. When the world is uncertain, it definitely helps to
And
have
let them,
connections.
we say that in the same sort of way.
Oh, sorry, we
That's
had a little bit of lag there. Um, you
that's
know,
that kind of relationship is what I see the future become. It's
yeah,
already becoming that.
yeah, that makes sense. I also think, can I add something I think is going to be part of the new world?
Please, yeah, oh, of course.
Um, so because of AI, change is now like going to be exponential. Like change that would have been in the linear world would have taken, centuries. Now, we're in the exponential curve up now, right? And so the world's changing fast. So what skills are necessary when things are changing fast? And I think one of the critical competencies of the new world is ability to adapt, ability to learn, unlearn, relearn. If that profession's not needed anymore, okay, what else do I got in my pocket that I can do? Or, like we've got it, like we're in the world of fast-paced change now. So having a network of deep, honest, true relationships that you can count on is critical. Like having the ability to change course, or like the old world where you could just be one thing and do one thing and life is simple, like that world is behind us now. So it's the age of adaptation. What did Darwin said? It's not the fittest of the species that survive, it's the most adaptable to change. And I think we're in that now. We've all got to be adaptable to change. And so anything
I,
that helps in
I
that
totally agree.
endeavor
I
is
totally,
important. Well, I wanted to ask you something as well, because I know you're really passionate about leadership. You've taught leadership, you've been a leadership consultant, you've written a book on leadership. And part of what you said earlier, like I want to circle back to that because I also sense part of the old world that is dying is this world of authority. The authorities, the systems, the institutions told us how to be, and we all went along with it because monkey see, monkey do. Everyone else is doing it, so they tell us we're one thing. Okay, we'll all be one thing, even if it feels inauthentic and stifling. So we've been in this age of external authority,
mm-hmm.
and I'm curious what your thoughts are regarding that kind of outside authority and the kinds of leadership that you've written and studied about and taught about and consulted about. Like, how do you compare and contrast this authority that we're now questioning and, sort of backing away from to self-curate who we are more, as the world is changing quickly and we have to adapt. Like the authorities don't provide quickly enough anymore. Like we've got to make decisions on our own. There's an element of self-leadership that I think is
Wow.
really critical in the new world. I worked in leadership development for almost a decade, and it was one of the main topic areas of my doctoral dissertation as well. Like I'm in that space. So can we just jam on leadership for a bit and what that means and like what
Sure.
leadership would look like in the new world we're talking about?
Certainly. So when I first became interested in leadership as a topic of study, which is in the mid 80s, I went and read a bunch of stuff, and I took a couple of seminar courses, and and I realized I disagreed with almost everything I was reading, and it was because it was all setting up the CEO as the heroic leader, or the president as the heroic leader, and all of us are starry-eyed followers. No, it's not that way at all. The people in your business are your leaders, and that key person is probably that office manager, or that general manager, or that regional manager who is keeping it all operating together as a team. So over time, I came to see that all leadership begins with personal initiative to create impact that makes a difference that matters. And by that, I am saying that everyone can function as a leader of impact. Doesn't mean they're in the role of leader, doesn't mean that they have the title of leader, but they can function as a person of leadership, and that the smart people, the smart CEOs, the smart general managers recognize that their place, their workplace is dependent upon their people becoming persons of leadership initiative. And they must feel freedom and permission to take initiative to solve problems. If your people are always constantly saying, we have this problem, what do we do? If they're having to ask you what to do, then you have a system that's set up to fail, and it's going to fail because you're never going to allow your people to ever reach their potential. And the only way they will reach their potential is if they're motivated to reach their potential, and they'll be motivated to reach their potential by taking initiative to solve problems and to communicate broadly and to innovate ways of doing things. I mean, and this is happening. This is now happening because there is no other choice. There's no other choice. You talk about authority. The authority is a big topic that no one wants to talk about. No one wants to talk about authority, and it's one of the most amazing things to me, because every business, every organization is built on an authority structure. But that authority structure is failing when the person who is in authority has really no accountability to anyone. And you can see that in all these institutions. No one is accountable to anyone any longer. And out of that is where all this corruption that comes from, is that we've broken authority and accountability apart. And we've broken that apart because organizations are not created as places of relationship where we're going to join together, we're going to have shared values, and we're going to be mutually accountable to one another because we care about one another. And no, that's not where we're all in competition to be influential and to exert power and to do all those sort of things. So that's another one of those transition points that I see us in, and it's not going to be pretty going through this, but once we've gone through it, I think all these new kind of structures will emerge from this, all relationally oriented, all built around really open conversations. And I think at that point, we're going to see something really special emerge, because it'll be different than anything we've ever experienced, because the hierarchy will be different. The hierarchies of power will be totally different than we've ever seen, because the fact that you and I can talk like we're talking now, we have a phone, and I could call you, in 20 minutes, and we could have a conversation. We could solve our problems using the technology that has been provided for us. And 30 years ago, that we didn't have that opportunity. When I started my career, we didn't have the opportunities we have now. So the authority now is in the relationship. It's not in the structure. And therefore, the relationship that we have with one another really is the key to what our future will look like. And that to
Yeah.
me is very exciting. I mean, that's why I'm going to live to 105 because I want to see this happen. It's good. I mean, it's all going to happen in the next 30 years.
Yeah, I know. It's an amazing time right now, and it's a nerve-wracking time. But by the way, I just want to say I completely agree with everything you just said. I worked in leadership training and development in the federal government. I was in charge of managing a number of different training programs for leaders from across the entire federal space, including some of the most senior people for a while. And I worked at the executive office of the president for a while under Bush and Obama. And so leadership has been my jam too. And one of the things that always kind of bothered me about the way we thought about leaders was, yeah, like there's some god or something, some superpower. Like and by the way, a lot of leadership positions are so detached from the reality of the front lines of organizations or like the real world because they're on their, they're in their power position and on their throne. And I prefer a world where leadership and decision making are much more distributed, where it's more democratic, as opposed to sort of like the hierarchy model. And I've never believed that leadership was a position or a title. I think leadership is a behavior, and any of us can do it. And
Yes.
I can even be a leader of myself. I almost wrote my doctoral dissertation on self leadership. And by the way, self leadership and polymathy are cousins.
Very close.
Yeah. So,
Let
anyway, I just wanted to share some of my thoughts that for
me,
me, to be a moral good person is not like these institutional power structures are inherently, they intended well and they didn't mean to be, but they've ended up oppressing and subjugating a lot of us so that a few in power could benefit and everyone else could just be,
well,
subservient.
let me say one more thing about that. Where you see authority without accountability, you have a structure that is inherently fragile and it must be supported by perception of reality rather than reality. And so a lot of the messaging that we get from these large institutions is really a way of hiding the fact that they're really on tenterhooks and they're really fragile and
Yeah, it's not a good look.
it could collapse very easily. And I'm not political in this. What I'm not making a political statement when I'm making that I'm about to make, but because I'm apolitical and I'm a I'm not a party person at all.
Same.
But I saw the emergence of Donald Trump as this kind of outsider who came and was the vehicle for seeing how fragile the system was. And its response to him really showed how fragile the system was and how corrupt it was. And now, whether he's a great president or not, that's a separate thing. But how the response to him really showed that there was this fragility within the structure of our nation's government that the people like yourself um, were maybe not subject to, but because there are a lot of people like yourself who serve their country in the mechanism of government, and we should honor the work that they do. But there are those who have a power invested in them in the places in their roles in government where they were very fragile because they were without accountability to anyone, and
Yeah.
and and I saw that as the kind of why the reaction to Trump was so vehement.
Yeah, I think people loving Trump was more for me a statement about them being unhappy with the status quo than it was because a lot of people can admit, well, Trump might be a psychopath or a sociopath. Okay, like he's not politically correct. He's not the best international representative. There's a lot of downsides of Trump, but at least he wasn't your typical politician. And people are so sick of their typical politicians that anybody else would do,
He's
even
not one of
Trump.
he's not one of us.
Yeah. So, can I share with you as well? So,
Yeah,
can I talk about my own? Okay, just for a minute.
of course.
Oh
It's your
God,
show.
I uh, I grew up such a goody two shoes. Okay, I was in Christian school since preschool to 12th grade. Jesus was great. I'm not religious anymore. but a lot of those lessons and values and ethics have stuck with me. And when I was a youngster, I decided pretty early on that I wanted to use my life for good. I wanted to be of service.
Mhm.
And so I was like, well, how do I do that? Where do I go? And for me, the idea of being of service, like I thought, oh, well, I'll have a career in government like that. If I want to make the world a better place, I'll work in government. And I was so bushy-tailed and bright-eyed about it. I really
Yeah.
thought government is where you do some good for people. And I did that for 15 years. And while I was still working in government, I began studying the polymathy in a new set. I wanted to study polymathy in a non-elitist population because one of the critiques of
Right.
my work was that polymathy and the way I studied it was sort of elitist. And so I made the decision to study polymaths in prison and write a book about it. And that began like a whole can of worms got open when I started. So I'm from like a part of government, the executive office of the president, the Center for Leadership Development. Like I'm in an office setting working for government, just, and there's frustrations. There's bureaucratic, stupid bullshit and like hierarchy and slowness and like administrative operational frustrations I had. But, I could live with it. Like I could deal with it. And then as an academic doctor, I began looking and getting to know human beings who were incarcerated. And when I started to hear their stories from their perspectives, their experiences with our government, like with law enforcement, with the courts and the prisons, what their experience had been. And I expect government to be a force for good. And now I'm confronted with the simple fact that our government is victimizing our own citizens by the thousands at least, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And they're certainly at a minimum letting us down as their population, as their only customer, really. We give government a third, some of us up to a half of our income, and then they're there to provide a service and goods to help us. And what
Yeah.
I discovered when I looked in the prisons and I started hearing real people's stories and I got to know the prison wives and the prison moms and all that, is I learned that the government's not as good as I thought it was. Like
Right.
it's not doing the good I thought it was supposed to do. And I no longer work in government and I've become a criminal justice reform advocate in addition to being a polymathy advocate. And so I just want to share that and see if you have any thoughts on that. That I've had like government broke my heart. When I looked under the hood close enough, it broke my heart. And
Mhm.
I don't know
Sure.
I don't know exactly how we get government to where it should be, but I think we have to start with telling the truth of it and hearing people's stories and finding out what's really going on. Because I do think our justice system is failing us. In the US, it's real bad. No one's talking about it. Of the first world countries, America's incarceration rate is way higher than other nations who are considered first world countries. America has a quarter, one fourth, 25% of the world's incarcerated are here. And we're only 5% of the global population. How do you explain that? And it's these authority figures, it's the government, it's the machine, it's the institutions which we have deferred to, and we've given them our trust. And what I've discovered once I've looked close is they don't deserve our trust. And we need to be real careful. We need to protect our people because a lot of families are being ruined and victimized by the very government that should be here to serve and protect us, who are paying for them. So I'm so upset. I get so fired up about it. And I know this channel is about polymathy, but since you're a leadership guy and I'm a leadership gal, and I'm just curious what do you think about the state of our government? Like, especially with considering like and I think you've spent some time in the prisons as a minister, right? Like, so what's your take on like how we're treating poor people, how we're treating drug addicted people, how we're treating mentally ill people? Like how do we deal with bad human behavior as a collective? And is our government that we've deferred to handle all this doing a good job or not?
Um, the first thing I would say is that the the bigness of the problem or our perception of the problem is such that it will demotivate us from trying to do anything. It just seems the structure as it has developed to continue to function as it is. I I have felt for a long time that the source of all the problems that we face begins and ends with money. And um, and and I don't know how we actually deal with the question of money because the system is designed to um, create wealth. The governmental system is designed to create wealth for a small segment of the population. And when I see that one of the big changes in in financial advisory is the tracking of congressmen and congresswomen's um, stock trades after closed door House of Representative meetings, you know, that tells me that there's a lot of inside trading going on through Congress. Um, you know, but they're not going to police themselves. They're not going to end insider trading for congressmen. I mean, they're immune. I mean, you know, there's a case before the Supreme Court right now about presidential immunity, and I've been listening to the arguments there. It's you know, it's the classic. We've got to protect our own little comfortable little situation because we have finally arrived and we got to take care of it. Um, I don't think there's a simple answer to your question. I think it begins by um, people like yourself, like me, having conversations, and we say, what is it that we want our communities to be like? And what is it that we want the people that live in our communities to experience as citizens and neighbors? And I think that begins all the way to what I think it begins at birth. And I think it begins with children. I mean, the I mean, talking about children and the exploitation of children. That's a simple phrase, right? The exploitation of children, but it is a highly lucrative industry in our world today, and far beyond anything you and I can imagine. Um, and I've just talked to people in government, people outside of government who have a connection to all of that world. And you ask, how is it that we have found ourselves at a point in time where the most vulnerable people in our society are the ones who are exploited the most? Um, you know, people who say never had a chance to have a decent education because of poverty or their parents were you know, addicts or whatever it may be. You know, there's a YouTube channel I love called Soft White Underbelly.
That's my favorite channel.
It's great. And if you all were to watch that, watch if you were to watch 100 of his interviews, it would change your perception of the way the world is actually functioning. And because he is talking to Mark is talking to the lowest of the lows, the people who are the most exploited, the most damaged. And the question is, why is it that way? But even more so, what do we do about that? And I don't think we actually know what to do about that. I think we have some perception of where we would like to be, but how we get from here to there is, and I don't think it starts with fixing things in Washington. I think it starts with fixing things in our local communities, and then local community. Because let me just add this in. So as a consultant for 20 years, one of my clients, one of the type of clients I have were municipalities. And one of the things I saw was the economic exploitation within the hierarchy of governmental agencies. So from federal government to state government to local government. And there was an exploitation of that went from the highest down to the lowest, where those agencies at the local level. And and I'm thinking, that's because we've allowed our values to become very transactional and very self self-serving. And to me, I just don't think about it anymore. I take it as a given because I think that for me, what I want to do is I want to encourage you to do what you can with the resources and the time you have to go make a difference in the world. And you do that with maybe two or three other people together. All of a sudden, you have something that's like a movement. I think that's where change really happens. I mean, I've heard people say that's not where change happens. It starts at the top. No, change does not start at the top. I guarantee you that. Change starts where the people feel the freedom to resist what is being imposed upon them that is unfair and unhealthy for them, their families, and their community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know,
And
I
let me say one more thing about this. I think that, and I want to put this into the context of polymathy, because that, I mean, we've kind of danced around that, and that's your field of academic research. It's a field of interest to me. I've been told I'm a polymath. I don't know if I am. I'm not like the polymaths I've met, but I've never been like anyone else. So that's maybe. But I think when people hear that word polymath, they think, oh, that's a really smart person. That's a genius kind of person. I want to dispel that notion, like we're dispelling the notion of what leadership is.
Mhm.
Leadership was a title. Polymath has become a title. Polymath is not a title, it's a set of behaviors. And for you, whoever you are, whoever, if you're a fan of Angela and you're listening and watching her every day or every time she puts out one of these, I want you to think that you don't have to take on that title, that label of polymath to be a polymath. All you have to do is become extraordinarily curious and never be satisfied that you have a final answer to anything.
Yeah. By the way, I completely agree. The term polymath has been associated with like dead geniuses from history, and that's just
Yeah.
not helpful. Like we do have
Yeah.
polymaths and polymathic people because it comes on a spectrum who are alive in current day. And I think there's great benefit to understanding what polymathy is and what it looks like in the modern context and how you support it and facilitate it because God knows we all need to have a polymathic learning orientation in a world of exponential change if you want to keep up. Um, and anyway, we do need to begin to wrap up because I gotta go. But I love that you brought up values because for me, that's like where the solution begins. And that's where the problem began. So when
That's
people's
right.
values got off track. Our institutions have turned into psychopathic monsters, sociopathic monsters, where they exist for
Right.
their own benefit and their friends, and they forget the reason they exist, including
Right.
government. Government is here for we the people, not for their benefit. And so I come back to, even though I'm not a religious person anymore and I'm not preaching, but I think Jesus did really have some wise things to say. And one of the things, if I had to boil down everything I know about that character, that person, that spiritual leader into like a condensed down nugget, I would say what he really stood for was do unto others as you would like done unto you. And if we all did that, we would quickly solve the problems plaguing our world and we'd stop co-creating hell on earth, which is kind of what we've been doing for a while. Like the haves are getting to have more, and the have-nots are growing in number. And that is not okay. Like, we got to take care of ourselves. We got to care about people, even people who look different and think different and speak differently from us, because we're all human beings. Come
Yeah.
on. And we're all also, like, in a way, we're the smartest creatures on earth. In a way, we're the stupidest, most damaging creatures on earth. But as the creature with the prefrontal cortex here on this rock floating in the massive expanse of space, I do think it's incumbent upon us to also take, not just take care of humans, but like take care of the planet and the creatures on it and all that as well. And it's got to start from a place of loving kindness and caring for other people, even if they're unlike you. Can we do that, people? Can we do that, humanity, please? All right, Ed, do you have any final thoughts as we wrap up here?
I think you need to be curious, but I think more importantly, you need to treat people with kindness. And since you brought it up, I would encourage you to read the Gospels in the New Testament and just read the stories of Jesus' interaction with people, and then try this little experiment. Every person you meet, put Jesus between you and them, and ask, what does Jesus think of them? And then and what I think you will find is that you will see how Jesus loves them and how Jesus loves you. And then that becomes a basis for us to work together and be mutually accountable and caring and respectful and trusting with one another.
Yeah, let's get back to a place of values and
Yeah.
ethics and morals and good treatment. Like, I think our institutions uh worked for some time, but they're way too immoral and unethical to keep working nowadays. The broken systems we've participated in aren't serving us anymore. So somehow, polymaths of the world, smart people, like, hopefully we can help figure this out over time, how to make a better world for all of us. All right, Ed. Well, thank you so much for coming. It was a
My pleasure.
pleasure to chat with you. And thank you everyone for watching. I hope you found this interesting. All righty. Bye.